I'm going to sort of pick up a little bit where we just left off, which was the sexual, this pollination always leads to seeds, or sexual reproduction always leads to seeds. So that seemed like a question which probably this audience is familiar with, but I always like to start with it because it sort of highlights the need for bees and pollination in general. So pollination, of course, is this process of taking pollen from male parts of a flower and transferring it to the receptive parts of female parts of another flower within the same species if we're going to have fertilization. And plants have this funny characteristic of not being able to move. So they've got a big challenge. And even if the male parts and female parts are a couple of centimeters away from each other on a plant, that might as well be a couple of miles away from each other if there's no wind movement or something, because pollen can't, well, maybe pollen can jump, but not very far. And so plants have this intimate relationship with insects and other animals that basically act as flying genitalia to transfer the sperm, the pollens containing sperm, and cause sexual reproduction. And so that's this movement here. And if we're lucky, if pollination leads to fertilization, post-pollination process, from that flower and the ovary below, we get a fruit full of seeds. Okay, and either we like to eat that if it's watermelon, at least I love to eat that if it's watermelon, or even if we are thinking about crops that the actual yield does not depend immediately on pollination, something like carrots or celery, lettuce. At some point, to grow it, with a few exceptions, someone had to plant a seed. And if we want a new variety that we're going to develop, someone had to develop a seed. And so agricultural sustainability over the long term depends on pollination. And if you like to eat beef, well, you got to feed that beef on silage or some kind of hay, and it's got to eat clover, and that needs pollination at some point in the process. So the result is that pollination is this key function. It's key across natural ecosystems. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of flowering plant species required. Some people would say it's a lot more than that. I mean, it's a scientific, esoteric debate. But it's a majority of plants. And the other thing that's interesting is when we look at plant populations, globally, we see that the majority of those populations are limited in their reproductive output by a lack of sufficient pollination. We call that pollen limitation. What that means is that those populations are very sensitive to changes, or they can be, to changes in the size of the population of pollinators or the composition, the types of pollinators that are out there. And that then means that some kind of changes, either in the way that we manage our natural or agricultural systems, can have profound impact on the outcome of that pollination process. Okay, and so we've recognized that for a long time, and increasingly, I think, so this is one of these strange things about science and practical understanding. We've known for a long, long time as humans that many crops require some kind of pollination. It's only recently, I think, that in the scientific community we've really gotten much more excited about recognizing the importance of pollination and the diversity of different pollinators out there for promoting pollination. And so there's a lot of recent studies showing the dependency of different primary food crops on pollinators. So about 35% of our primary food crops depend on pollination, or they benefit from it in some ways. And there's this other estimates of about 1,300 crop varieties worldwide, 70% rely on animal pollination, most of it by insect. So to make that a little bit more clear, this is sort of a picture of breakfast. If you're lucky, that was your breakfast. And so it isn't the case that all of our food depends on pollination by any means. But if we took away the products that were dependent on pollination from that breakfast, it suddenly becomes a lot more boring. So we lose about half the cup of coffee. We lose everything fun on the cereal. We don't lose the cereal grains. Maybe lose the honey on our toast. The other thing that we lose is a lot of the nutritional value. Okay, so we lose a lot of crops that contain very important vitamins and other nutrients for human well-being. Okay, so In fact,
wait, a question over here.
What are the cows eating that are giving us the milk that's left over?
You know, that depends on where your cow is. But if you're looking at the dairy industry in California, for example, so a lot of that is grass-fed, but at some point in the life cycle of the cow, or the milk cycle, it's also feeding on alfalfa probably, or some kind of alfalfa hay or silage, you know, very common silage. And that is, again, we don't cut that crop in any given season. It doesn't need pollination. But the seed for alfalfa that we plant every few years to generate that crop is entirely dependent on pollination. And I'll show an example of alfalfa in a minute. But so if you look at our major fruits and fiber crops around, many of them are dependent on pollination. And that pollination is carried out or achieved by a combination of two primary insects. Right? We have managed pollinators, dominated strongly by Apis mellifera, our honeybee, European honeybee, and some combination of wild and native species, many of which are not managed and some of which are managed. And so it's this pair of possibilities that we have. Honeybees are not the cornerstone of pollination by chance. They have a number of characteristics which make them really well suited to agricultural pollination in the sense of like large agriculture or even small agriculture. They're social and colonial. Okay, they live in these white boxes now. They make and they're perennial. Okay, and so what that means is that we can basically take those colonies and place them where we want them, move them around. They have large numbers of insects available in their pollinating force, and they're quite generalist in the way they forage, so we can put them on different things and sort of manage them in that way. And so this is what we have come to, at least in some of California's agriculture, is moving from this history of sort of resident beekeeping with modest numbers of hives to industrial beekeeping, where a lot of the hives that we use, at least now, up until at least this week when almonds are just about finished, are coming from across state lines or other parts of the state. They're trucked in on semis, and so we have this sort of industrial style of beekeeping. The way we treat other domesticated animals in our agriculture too. We treat cattle the same way, and so bees are just now increasingly treated that way. And so what that does for us is it provides us large numbers of pollinating insects for the need. And why do we need that? Well, we've made decisions as a society in the way that we're going to undertake agriculture. And I'm not here to get into that debate because that's really a complex one. But to sustain production for a growing population, decisions that we've made as a society are to grow large field sizes in California. We have among the largest field sizes that you'll see anywhere of the non-commodity sort of crops, of soybeans and corn. And we grow, and we also have sought varieties for very good reasons that produce large numbers of flowers so that we get a high density of fruit production. And so what that means is that there's a large need for pollination, and so we need a lot of animals, a lot of insects to go out and take care of that pollination. Okay, and so honeybees can do that very, very well. Okay, so there's another example, right? The issue that arises, so this shows, I don't know if you can really see that, it's actually quite small here. This shows long-term trends in bee-pollinated crops, with the top two panels looking at the increase in pollinator-dependent crops from time as they go from sort of historical up to the present and projection just a little bit into the future. What we see globally is an increasing trend in the dependency of our crop production on pollination. Okay, so it involves demographic transitions in various countries in the world. You'll see that the quote developed world, that's us, does not see a strong trend, a strong change there. It's mostly in other parts of the world where the demand for pollination is increasing continuously at this point.
Before you change that slide, I couldn't read the source, and I was wondering if you could.
Yeah, the source is from, it's a series of authors led by Marcelo Azen, who's a researcher in Argentina, and looking at world FAO and other global databases on world food production, the types of commodities that are produced, and then summarizing the data to project or to retrospectively to look at the trends over time. And so the bottom shows what the predicted deficit in pollination will be as a result of that change. So what we see is, even in the developed world, there will be an increasing lack of pollination that we need. And that's much more profound in the quote developing world. Okay? And that really stems from the combination of factors that increasing acreage and the transition to more pollination-dependent crops, combined with declines in the availability of managed bees. Okay, and so this shows even just for the U.S., so this is U.S. non-citrus fruit and nut crops between the 1980s to just a couple of years ago. There's a profound demand, and I mean, we're most familiar with that transition in the case of almonds in California, right? We're planting almonds like crazy and continue to increase the acreages. Okay, so that's coupled, though, with what we see, at least in the U.S., depending on the region, but is generally sustained decline in the number of managed honeybee colonies. And so the figure on the top shows the number of U.S. colonies, and this is data from various state apiculturalists and the U.S. DA that keep track of the number of managed colonies from the 1950s to the present, just a decrease. Basically, we just don't have as many hives available. And that, you could argue that that's even more of a challenge depending on what you're growing. So as the need for pollination-dependent crops by various companies and others that sort of hold the power. So if you want pollination on your non-almond crop in California in the spring, you're up against the almond mills. So again, the details of that also are really interesting to consider. It's just something to bear in mind as we think about it. And it sort of sets the stage for the research that we're doing to try and sort of understand this more integrated strategy. So the other cause of those declines, arguably, is the arrival of a couple of, they're not new anymore, all of them, but what we now call persistent diseases that are problematic for honeybees. And to their credit, the beekeepers basically, again and again and again, have met that challenge. Okay, it hasn't been easy, and if you ask them, they'll probably tell you, really, we've been able to meet that challenge. It's a constant, struggle to deal with those challenges. But whenever there's been a need for dealing with that, they've continued to deliver the number of colonies that have been needed for the agricultural pollination industry. Yeah?
Does that also reflect the decrease in the number of beekeepers?
It certainly does. So there's a decrease in the number of beekeepers, but that's also relates to a change in the average size of a beekeeping operation. So part of the decrease, at least recently, in beekeepers is the increased complexity and challenge of management. So when I was a kid keeping bees, you could sort of put your bees out and check them a few times, and as long as you were sort of okay with bees, they would probably be there. That's absolutely not true anymore, as you all probably know. You can't assume that, in fact, that won't work at all. And so, so as we face these more persistent challenges, they require more management, and so it's harder for hobbyists to keep that going. And given the demands from the agricultural industry, it's also more challenging for them to manage that. I mean, that's part of it. I'm not a honeybee professor or something. I work with non-aphis bees, but this is part of the story.
I'd like to just add one thing to that.
Yeah.
In the past 5 or 10 years, there's been a huge resurgence of interest in small time beekeeping. And so I think that there probably are more beekeepers now than ever before. And in some regions, I think it's very important the contribution that they make, the small timers that make towards pollination in their local areas. California has a completely different dynamic, for example, than New York State, where small time local beekeepers can get the job done. Whereas California requires large-scale beekeeping. So that's all I'm saying.
Yeah. So, I think that could be true to an extent, although I would say that the patterns of movement of commercial colonies are similar on the East Coast for the pollination of orchards, too. So bees are moved around. But if that's the trend, which, again, I don't keep track of it in the very last few recent years, that would be, in my opinion, fantastic, right? So more localized, diversified beekeepers as part of the strategy. I don't think we can move away from the other, but yeah. So the other thing that we see is challenges and declines in other key pollinators, and the notable ones I'd say are probably bumblebees. So a couple of species in particular, and several others are debated, but probably the case. We see very, very clear declines. In fact, global extinctions or regional extinctions of those species as well. And the reasons for that is another talk. I don't know. Maybe Gordon will talk about that, or somebody else will talk about that. But maybe disease, landscape change for sure, possibly pesticides, all sorts of things. Really fascinating topic. But they hearken, what might be coming, or what's already happening, which are these stressors. And probably second to honeybees in terms of value for many sort of diversified crops would be those bumblebees. So that is a real concern. So how bad could it be? I don't know whether the previous speaker showed this. I missed this up. But how bad could it be, the loss of bees for pollination? Well, these are pictures which are no longer valid because of the demographic transition in China itself. These are pictures of pollination of orchards in southern China, where the thought is that the use of industrial pesticide use was profound enough and beekeeping not developed in the way it needed that basically there was no pollination available for apple orchards. At that time, though, China, where many people were still in the rural areas more, and that's changed. This can't happen in China anymore. There were lots of people. Well, so people could pollinate too. I mean, that sounds absurd, right? But that is indeed what was going on. So actually, people by hand, with little pots of pollen in their hand and cigarette filters, hand pollinating entire orchards. So that is not a sustainable future, probably, unless you really can change what high school would like to do in this country. No. Okay. So the costs are profound. And so I think again, so that's sort of the introduction. The alternative, I think, as we move forward, or at least one strategy that we're interested in, is this idea of more integrated approaches to understanding pollination for agriculture in North America and beyond. So, and by that I'm talking about here the combined use of different pollinator species along with habitat augmentation, management practices to provide reliable and economical pollination for our crops. Together we get this idea of integrated crop pollination. And just to sort of, in case you're interested, you can go to this website, icpbees.org, which is out of Michigan State, which is the core of this integrated national project looking at diversified pollination strategies, including these elements. So at the top and center we have honeybees. To their side we have a combination of wild and alternative managed pollinators. On your left, things that have to do with bee-friendly farming, basically, or right. So horticultural practices, pesticide stewardship, and habitat management, and then a component of a scientifically rigorous sampling, and then explicitly outreach and dissemination of integration using the the participation of the growers themselves. Not saying this is what you need to do, but trying to work with our grower communities to see what they believe are the alternatives as well. Yeah. I'm so glad that you asked that question. So, what is an alternative managed bee other than honeybee? Here we go. So, in that strategy I mentioned wild pollinators and I mentioned alternative managed pollinators. And so I'm going to talk about both of those now. Okay, so if we look at, yes?
I'm sorry, that last slide you had a website on the bottom. Is that slide available on that website?
Is that slide, this one?
Yeah, that one.
I don't know. Good question. I'm not actually sure. Probably you could get that image on there. I don't know if it's a slide or something you could download. But...
Okay, I can email you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so wild pollinators and alternative managed pollinators. So So we have honeybees, a single species or a set of species, depending on where you are in the world, that are managed. In North America, we have additionally some 3,500 other bee species that are native, and a number of introduced exotic ones as well that are non-honeybees. If we look at California, in terms of bee biodiversity, we've got about 1,500 or so species in California. We can zoom in. This says, it's a little hard to read, it says the Honeybee Haven at UC Davis, which some of you may know. And so Robin Thorpe and maybe Gordon too, I don't know. He hangs out there and helps Robin out from time to time. Robin's been surveying bees in this half-acre area. It's 1/2 acre. Before it was just sort of grassy, not much of anything. I think there's a building that we burned down there. And Robin has found over 65 species of native bee there, maybe even over 70 at this point. So even in very localized areas, we have a diversity of pollinators that are potentially available depending on their need. Well, how might they contribute? Well, it turns out that if we look at the contributions to pollination from different species in addition to honeybees, we find that many native species are actually very efficient crop pollinators. This shows one of my favorite examples, which actually is alfalfa. Okay, so this is alfalfa pollination, and that's the alfalfa leafcutter bee. It's a naturalized species. It's not native to North America. It's not clear how the introduction happened. We don't believe it was intentional. But what we find is that these other species, depending on the crop, can often be more effective on a per visit basis. So per individual bee out there, we're not likely to get the 60,000 per colony kind of thing that we're getting with honeybees, but on a per individual basis, they're often more efficient to pollination. Alfalfa is a great example. So that shows alfalfa flower. I don't have a pointer, but if you look up on the right-hand side, you'll see the sexual parts of alfalfa, which are all contained together, the male and female parts, in this sort of column. And it's a trigger flower, which means that when a bee visits it, there's a very rapid change in the structure of that flower, and it basically triggers the pollen to be released and deposited onto the bee, or sometimes a little bit of self-pollinating too. What that does to honeybees, because of their morphology, their size, the honeybee basically takes that column on the chin, hits them under the chin every time. And they don't enjoy that. I don't know what a bee enjoys, but that seems to be a negative stimulus for the bee. And so they're reluctant to do that. They will visit alfalfa, but it takes large numbers of bees, and it's not a preferred flower. This is the little alfalfa leafcutter bee. It's a smaller bee, and because of the way it visits, it takes it on the chest. Okay? Chest. And it doesn't seem to be bothered by it. So it ends up being a very efficient pollinator and moves about its business and does a really good job. And it's managed populations in huge numbers in the northern U.S., in Idaho, and other of the sort of northern states where we grow a lot of seed alfalfa for seed production. Yeah, we don't need it to be able to cut alfalfa and make it into hay or silage and feed animals, but you need it for seed production.
What does it mean they're managed?
So we manage honeybees in white boxes with comb and all that sort of thing. But these bees are solitary. They don't make a colony, and they nest in tunnels in wood. And so the management of alfalfa leafcutter bee is pretty involved, but it basically makes a nest by cutting little pieces of leaf matter, often alfalfa, and making this cigar-like structure inside the tube with individual cells of its offspring lined up one after the other in a row. Okay, so we can take that block, so we have a block, let's say it's a block that's 6 by 8 feet, drilled with little tiny holes all over it. And the bees will fill that up with their nests, and they make a machine that actually pushes those nests right out, like a bunch of little fingers that push them out of the holes. So they're open at both ends, and they can push them out. And then you have little cells, individual offspring in little cells, and you can then put those out in where you want them, and they'll emerge and fly around and pollinate, make their nests. And they have diseases, just like honeybees do, and they have manage, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So that was one example. The other would be something like this bombus, which is visiting tomato flower here. Tomato doesn't have nectar, So it's not particularly attractive at all to honeybees for any reason, and they can't really pollinate it because the pollinated tomato requires a buzz pollination. So the bumblebee can vibrate its flight muscles in a way kind of like shivering at a high frequency, causes the release of pollen from the flower, and you get pollination. Tomato doesn't, not all tomato varieties require insect pollination, but our work and those of colleagues shows that they benefit from it. You get sweeter, larger fruit if you pollinate. That's true of many fruit, and it's certainly true of tomato. But honeybees won't buzz. They don't buzz. So the question is, okay, so that you have these two things. More efficient in certain crops and able to pollinate crops that maybe honeybees don't go to. But honeybees have huge numbers, and they can be moved around in certain ways. So there's a trade-off. And so the question is really in what context of the alternative pollination strategies are valuable. And work so far, I would say, suggests a couple of things. First of all, it matters where the farm is located if you're going to use wild pollinators. And the management type seems to matter. So work of ours in colleagues from California on tomatoes and sunflower and watermelon shows pretty consistently that native bees can provide full pollination of some of these crops in the best possible situation for bees. In the most friendly farms, organically managed farms, near to natural habitat. Okay, so there are resident populations of those bees. The on-farm management is particularly good for them. Our work, I would also say, shows that the organic designation itself is probably less important of those two, and maybe more the diversity and complexity of the farm itself is the more important of the two. But what we basically find is that native bee contributions in an unmanaged way decrease with isolation from natural habitat. Okay, so what are alternative managed pollinators? So the integrated pollination strategy, I want to first talk a little bit about, really briefly about alternative managed pollinators, and then about our work with augmenting on-farm habitats to promote more wild populations in a non-managed sense. So this is almond, about now, maybe last week. Huge acreages, huge numbers of blossoms. A very difficult challenge to think about in the current way that we have agricultural set up for wild bees. How could you possibly get that many wild bees when you've got 280 acre blocks of almond, one after the next, and then expect them to be able to penetrate that block, get the pollination done to provide sufficient pollination? So we use honeybees, but we can imagine using alternative managed bees. So this is the same orchard a little bit later, and now you can see in there revealed these little yellow boxes. Okay, so those yellow boxes are the nest boxes set up for an alternative pollinator, the blue orchard bee, Osmia lignaria, which is a native bee to the western United States. And what you see in the boxes are little bundles of cardboard tubes with the back end covered, so it's a dark tunnel basically that the bee goes into. And like that alfalfa leafcutter bee, here's another way of managing with little blocks, like I talked about for the alfalfa leafcutter bee, these blocks drilled with holes. The bees will go in and each female builds a series of nests in those blocks. And they turn out to be very, very efficient pollinators of almond, more efficient on a per visit basis than honeybees. And very recent work that we've done in collaboration with folks at UC Berkeley and in Germany, surprisingly, shows that the presence of wild bees, including these managed bees, actually changes the effectiveness of honeybees. And so we get a synergy between the two, so that the presence of other bees in the orchard makes the honeybee a more effective pollinator. And so if we're talking about intensification of agriculture or trying to achieve higher levels of pollination, we could do that by more bees, or we can increase the efficiency. And since we have problems with the availability of honeybees, it would be fantastic if we could somehow increase the efficiency of their pollination in that context. Okay, and so Dr. Claire Britton, who's a postdoc in my lab now, sort of led some of that work in collaboration with another Claire Kremen at Berkeley and our lab at UC Davis.
What's the expected mechanism?
You could. Let me get right to that for you. So here are the sort of results. Basically what we see is single visit pollination by honeybees. This is not looking at the blue orchard bee itself, which it is more efficient on a per visit basis. That's a separate effect. But the honeybees themselves, this shows the percentage of visits with successful pollination on the left-hand side, and then the percent fruit set when we look at visits, looking at individual visits by honeybees with and without the presence of native bees. And so you see an increase in both cases. Okay, so there's a change in the way that honeybees are doing the job. What on earth is the mechanism for that? Okay, well, almond pollination in a nutshell, okay, is the following. So we grow multiple, the previous speaker talked about this, so we, different varieties of crops we grow, and almond is a case of a crop that is grown with multiple varieties per orchard. Because of harvest practices, we need to have each row having a single variety. Otherwise we get rows that are producing nuts at different times and different sizes, and that isn't a way to manage them. But the varieties are self-sterile, okay? So within a row, the movement of pollen around between those trees does not lead to fruit production or nut production. So what we basically need is movement between rows. So bees moving within the canopy of a tree or along the row, we get poor pollination. Bees moving between rows leads to fertilization and nut set. So you know what's coming now, right? So what did Claire Britton do? Claire, I should have put in the figure with the cages. She did work in open orchards, and this is basically goofy scientists watching bees move in different ways up in the canopy, standing on ladders, watching that, but that's how you get the job done. And then some very controlled work in very large flight cages that have 8 almond trees per cage. These are gigantic cages. And then characterizing the movement patterns of honeybees within and between trees with and without the presence of other bees. And so we find in both cases, in the open orchard case and the caged case, honeybees alone in yellow and with blue orchard bee in the other case move more between rows. The proportion between rows is higher in the presence of those bees. So that isn't exactly the mechanism, but it's sort of the process that's going on. So they're moving in a different way. Their behavior has been altered. So this year we have been looking at what that might be caused by. The densities of those bees relative to honeybees are very, very low. So it's not that they're like banging into them and making them move physically. So we're looking at things like, do they leave particular scent marks on the blossoms? And that's all very esoteric kind of university type stuff. But if it were a scent marked sort of thing, that could be amazing too. So if you're thinking as sort of like, an orchard manager, wow, I can spray the blossoms with a chemical. Makes the bee, right? So that kind of stuff is a possibility. So there are all sorts of things that could follow from that. Are we finding that? Not yet. It's not clear that is a mechanism. So we're looking at different reasons for that.
Just to kind of mention that, so not that you say more effective, but when the scientist says more effective, depending totally on the growing situation, it's very specific.
Yeah, so you're talking about things like, well, it depends on nutrients, it depends on water in the orchard.
The situation of trees in these rows as opposed to another system that would be different.
Yeah, so that's true. You mean, so if we grow our almonds in a different way?
Yeah, so it's not been more effective overall, but more effective for that very specific situation with almonds and rows.
Right, true. Although that is the way that all almond, as far as I'm aware of, in the state is grown. So in terms of the context
around, you look for the way to arrange the almonds to make it more effective for all the pollinators.
Absolutely. So let me get distracted for a moment here and not debate you at all because it's a great idea. But so one thing in a venue like this, and in my lab too, we're thinking about pollination, right? When you're an almond grower, that's one of about 50 things that you're thinking about. And so we also don't have the possibility, and this is why this sort of strategy that I was talking about with integrated crop pollination, we work with those growers. Because we could tell them, you could plant your orchard in a different configuration, and that would really improve pollen transfer, and you get better pollination. And that probably is true. Probably absolutely right. But they would never do it in the way that the almond industry or even a modest-sized grower is, because the way that almonds are harvested, which you probably, maybe you know, right? I mean, they go along the trees with shakers, and they shake the tree, and they fall, and then you sweep them up. And so having a variety that that's all the same in terms of post-production, et cetera, is critical to the sort of food delivery chain, the way that we grow things. It'd be like saying, we should actually grow our tomatoes with tomato, then watermelon, then a little strip of corn, then another tomato plant, and water, and then you would say, try and get your field crew, if you're a small grower or a mechanical harvester, to actually harvest that stuff, and forget about it, right? So we come up against other challenges, and so this is the problem, right? There are a lot of these things that you almost look at and you say, wow, if we just did it this way, it would work really, really great. And so, but we have to back up and look at the whole production system.
That's a great idea. But just thinking, I grow almonds in Sacramento Valley, and the tree spacing is, say, a typical one would be like 20 by 18 feet. And okay, the rows being 20 feet apart, the trees being 18 feet in a row. So what you're talking about is kind of like alternating varieties in one tree row, which could be an option, but still you'd only be gaining like 2 feet. And then for harvest purposes, if you were just harvesting every other tree, you'd end up having to have 20
Exactly.
food loss.
Exactly. So we're looking at given the context of the system, what can we do in terms of pollination to fit it into the context to make it as sustainable as possible within the entire agricultural system? And so, at least in this system, as you point out, which is the system, the presence of the wild bees seems to make a difference. And so far, growers that we talk to, we're working with some of the big ones and some of the small ones, are interested in the integration of some of these other species, where it could fit. And then in other things that we tell them to do, they're not interested at all. Because it doesn't fit in their system. Like we say, well, what if you plant, very low-lying flowering plants underneath your orchard canopy, and so then the ground will be bare, and that's the end of that conversation. Okay, right, because you have to harvest off the ground. But we would argue that if you plant the right plants, the organic material is burned off long before that, and it won't interfere with the harvesting process. But those are complicated sociological conversations more than they are scientific conversations. So on the teams that we work with, we also have sociologists working because we have to understand what the barriers to adoption are. It's not, it's like politics, right? I mean, we can, okay. Yes.
Well, my concern is the science geared towards the commercial grower and the way it's grown? Or are you gathering enough science to actually say what the bees are actually doing?
Yeah.
Where's the focus? Where's the study focus, and what information is then delivered? Is it real science if we're just focusing towards a commercial grower? If the grower is directing the science.
Well, I don't think commercial almond production. I'm a professor of sustainable agriculture, so in a sense of life. So I'm really on your side. But the reality of almond production, that is reality. The reality is we don't grow almonds as single or paired trees in small polycultured orchards that really, maybe some people do. But the reality of the cropping system, worldwide, Italy, wherever it is this. So in terms of the rigor of the science, it's well replicated. It's in different contexts. So I believe the science is rigorous. It is for the context, but I guess you could. Do we work with large and small growers? Yes. Does the same pattern?
The reason why the bee now zigzag instead of fly straight, or why the honeybee moves away from the other bee, it's in that particular environment, not necessarily.
Not necessarily in what environment?
I'm just saying, if you were looking at the science of why that bee is doing that, it's doing that under that situation, as is any experiment.
I guess that this is the entire scope of almond production. It isn't produced in another way. Would they do the same in plum orchards or within apple orchards? I don't know, but we certainly haven't claimed anything about those other contexts. So we do know though that we have done the same work. Well, we haven't. A colleague of mine has done work similar to this with sunflowers. And the same thing seems to be true there, that the presence of wild bees in the sunflower field causes a change in the way that the honeybees move, that's what she thinks it is too, that leads to greater cross-pollination, and so she gets a higher seed yield in that work. And so that's a different context, a different crop, etc. Is it needed for the polycultural small organic CSA grower that's growing, one row of this and one row of that? So what we find in those contexts is, no, it probably isn't. But the whole context changes in those situations too. Many of those people don't bring in honeybees at all. They rely on wild bees. They know that the wild bees are fine in those contexts, and that's fantastic. So that's all about the context. Thanks. Yeah. Yes?
I'm curious about what other theories there are beyond the sort of the scent trail marking from the wild bees. So what other theories have you guys got as far as what might be changing the honeybee's behavior?
Maybe I'll leave that for. So she asked what were the variety of different alternative hypotheses other than the leaving of scent markings by different bees that might cause the observed change in the pattern of movement. And rather than get into, maybe we could talk right afterwards, because then otherwise I won't get onto the really cool stuff. I just threw this in here. Just like, I want to talk about wildflower plants. Okay.
I was wondering about the percentage of the nectar and if you had a cover crop or something, could that be effectively
Yeah, let me come to that later, because that's an issue that's really related to the wildflower plantings. And again, understanding the context in which you're hoping to augment habitat, but having to understand the pollination reality of doing that in a cropping system. Because obviously, augmenting habitat by planting really attractive wildflowers raises all sorts of, sends off crazy bells in the farmer's head, right? That why would I ever want to do that? I want to keep the bees on the crop, right? So let me come, or remind me if I don't mention that and come back to it. But certainly different almond varieties do differ in the details of their nectar composition and in the amount of nectar they produce. And so, when we design an experiment, that's part of the control that we try to deal with. But that is true, and plants in general are all over the place in terms of amino acid composition, nectar, and pollen, and everything else. Yeah. Okay. Let me step away from the managed bee thing. I'm so happy to see the excitement in that. I don't normally talk about it, and one of the most interesting things is, so most of the work that we do in the lab, or the other big part, is about the diversification of farmscapes and agricultural landscapes in general, and the augmentation using wildflowers to try and promote populations of wild pollinators. And so what we found when we talked to growers is they're way more excited about alternative managed bees. So that's why we've done some of that work. So again, catching the ear of your grower audience, if you're a blueberry grower, or if you're an almond grower, or you're an apple grower, they are much more really excited about the potential for other managed species. I think it's partly maybe because people who grow things, right? That's like, yeah, that's familiar, right? You can put these things on there, you can manage, and partly because they understand the practical details, something that you can put there in large numbers, get reliable pollination, so it's pretty interesting. But nonetheless, we do a lot with enhancing habitat, and I would say this is for wild and managed bees alike, because one of the contexts we work in is almond, where it's so early in the season, a lot of what we're talking about doing is for increasing the nutritional diversity for honeybees, and for providing an extended bloom a little bit beyond the almond. So this is the reality of agriculture in the Central Valley, and it's maybe not its best case, but it can look even more dramatic than that as you head south, where we basically have used most of the land surface that's even available, even right up to what we call a riparian or a river zone, right up to the allowable limit of the water course, to grow various crops. And so the irony of that, what I call the irony of intensive agriculture and pollination, is that intensive agriculture, by this, challenges bee populations, whether they're managed apis populations or wild bee populations, by decreasing the amount of diverse forage flowering plants that are available, reducing the nutritional diversity of pollen and nectar sources, increasing pesticide application in most contexts, which can increase mortality and also physiologically stress the populations, probably increasing the propensity for disease in those. And we basically do away with the nesting sites for a lot of types of native bees. In the very places where we most need pollination, okay? The fields where we have the most bloom, the highest density of bloom is where we need the pollination, and yet these are the places that challenge the bees the most. And so I call that the irony of intensive agriculture and pollination. So what we find in terms of wild bees, so I'm going to talk mostly about wild bee populations now. What we find is that the bee populations will persist where their resource needs are met. And if we really sort of simplify the situation, animals need a place to live and something to eat, right? And maybe protection from natural enemies. But so we have these two primary resource types that are what we call complementary. You can't substitute flowers for a place to live, and you can't substitute a place to live for flowers. They don't trade off. You need both. And so what we've been trying to do, or what our research program is doing, is looking at ways to promote these kinds of resources within these intensive agricultural contexts to try and bolster populations of native pollinators and stabilize or sustain pollination in different contexts. And so I want to talk about restoring floral resources primarily. We're working with the nesting resources a lot, and part of what we're doing is trying to understand whether the implementation of the flower resources brings with it opportunities for nesting, certainly for soil nesting species, which can be really important. So we're looking at landscapes that are pretty sterile in terms of anything else. It's just some wheat plots that are up there, and adding back in there these large strips of diverse wildflowers to help the bees. Okay, and so this process involves a number of different steps. It is about selecting and evaluating plants for pollinator conservation and pollination service. Okay, so we have, in the first phase, I'll talk about the selection of plant species. Phase 2, evaluation and establishment to test for plant performance. And then really evaluating the functioning of those wildflower plants. And that functioning is two things. Do the wildflower plots actually attract bees in? Are they supporting their populations? And from the grower's perspective, are they also enhancing pollination service, the delivery of pollination within that landscape? And this is a project that is that I'm heavily involved with, and also a research scientist in my lab, Kimura Award. And we work with a number of different groups, a lot of farmers throughout the valley, and then also with NRCS and the Xerces Society and others, as well as, interestingly, some large companies that have been involved sort of directly or indirectly through initiatives. And these are players in the system that I want to acknowledge. This is part of the initial research was part of something called Operation Pollinator, which is funded by Syngenta. Whoa! And not only by Syngenta Crop Protection Division, which is the pesticide division. And one could, again, have a whole conversation about why that might be. But from our perspective, to make a meaningful change within the agricultural industry in California, to reach not only early adopters, people that already are interested in supporting pollinators, but your more traditional, conventional growers, which most of the land is held by, we are going to have to engage a more diverse array of stakeholders. These large companies control a lot of agriculture. And so by trying to engage them bit by bit in appreciating the importance of supporting pollinator health, that's going to be part of the game plan making a difference in agriculture. So that's just, so they've certainly been supportive of that in some ways. So what we're talking about here is we have to identify a series of characteristics of a diverse, all potential wildflowers that will grow in the state, looking for things that are to do with regionally relevant. Will they grow in the Central Valley in this part of California, or in the foothills or the Coast Range, wherever the work that we're doing is? Is the seed available to plant those wildflowers? That's a big issue, because it turns out you have to plant what's available. You can't plant what's not available. It has to be cost effective, again, or a grower will be interested, and then that'll be the end of the conversation. We use a combination of perennial and annuals. We need reliable growth, a bloom period that supports the pollination of the crop we're interested in. And so again, what we choose depends on what the goal is. Is it to pollinate watermelon? Is it to support diversity of crops? What is the goal? And so tailoring those mixes to try and meet those. We also critically need pest neutrality. The biggest concern of growers, the two biggest are your wildflowers weeds, and do they support pests of micron? Right? Oh, and do they actually help pollination? That's the order of the conversation. So we have to be aware of that. And so from the standpoint of pollination, they have to be attractive, rewarding, they have to be able to grow in abundance, enough resource. Diversity is important, and we need to be considering particular species of interest. Essentially, what we try and do, right, is to, for many of our projects, is design a mix of wildflowers that will provide resources over an extended period of time to support different pollinators throughout the season, with no interruption in bloom. So that if it's a bee like a bumblebee that's got a long flight season, there will always be resources there. They'll support things in the early season, they'll support things in the late season. And so designing that mix with all these other caveats in mind at the same time. And then, as part of it, again, demonstrating the importance of technology transfer, working with early adopters, doing full economic analysis. So we work with ag economists at Davis and at Michigan to understand, well, what are all the costs that are involved in this compared to the expected benefits. If it doesn't make sense cost-wise, then we might have other reasons for doing it, but it doesn't make economic sense, at least. Okay, and so the goal then is to get bee habitat establishment by farmers, basically, to increase yields, increase crop quality, which is something that is really coming to the fore now, with realizing that in the quote developed world, we don't so much have a problem with the amount of specialty crops we can grow, but other aspects are really important to us. So things like shelf life, the nutritional balance of the individual fruits that we're growing, all these kinds of things are becoming really, really interesting. And what we're finding is that pollination can really affect those in combination with environmental factors at the same time. Calcium balance in apples, for example, why would we ever care about that? It affects the shelf life, the stability of the product, etc. It's really same thing in almonds we found. And the other goal is not only one of increased production, but of stability of yield. So growers would, of course, like a good production, but what they really want is reliable production, so that they can plan year to year without a lot of variability. Okay, so we've targeted a bunch of different plant species, and in the first phase of this research, we looked at a series of different mixes that we tested, and these just show, some of them contain all annual plants, some combinations of annuals and perennials, some perennials only. We measure plant density, count and identify the bees on those flowers, and compare the costs versus pollinator abundance on those different mixtures. And so we've done that for 3 years on these different mixes, and that follows up on a whole series of surveys of these plants in wild and managed contexts to know what plants to start with at the first part. We choose them, then we trial them. Here's kind of what we find. The details of the bars don't matter, those just show the different mixes. We have native bees in green, honeybees in purple, hoverflies and butterflies on the bottom. But what we basically find is that you see the control is always way over on the left. So you see that mixes in general are improving the abundance. This is mean number of individuals. And in particular, mixes that seem to incorporate perennial plants in them. The perennial plants we thought would take a while to perform, but they grow really well even in the first year if we get them established and they flower well, and they seem to really promote pollination. you'll see that honeybees and native bees respond slightly differently to the mixtures, and hoverflies and butterflies as well. Yeah.
Are we comparing the sites? Are you solarizing them, or are you using ground-up control all the week, or you lay down the mix of weight?
Yes.
Okay. All the above?
Both. It depends on the context. So we also look at management for different contexts, depending if you're organic, if you're conventional, if it's a huge site, if it's a tiny site, and look at the relative effectiveness of the different establishments.
Is the flavor of the honey that comes out of these fields, is that important at all?
I have not looked at anything related to that at all, so I could not tell you. It's an interesting question. No idea.
Excuse me, really quick, we have about 5 minutes left in the presentation, so we can hold questions till the very end. We can try and it's a very hot topic, and it's like what you said, it's great, all the interest, but we'll try to keep things roughly in the schedule. Thanks.
I think we can do it. Okay, so the basic message is that when we put wildflower strips in, here shows a summary of that. We always are comparing again against the control margin. If we plant the strip out there, we're comparing it to the case where there isn't a wildflower strip planted within the same landscape context, often on the same general farmscape, and looking at the difference. And so we get an increase in diversity, the mean richness, the number of bee species, and the abundance. And we get that increase across the season. So we get a bump up in the function of the strip is high in terms of attracting pollinators to it and supporting them in that regard. And from those trials of different mixes, what we have gone on to do then is to identify from our mix. We also take data plant species by plant species. So we're out there like not only recording visitation to the mixture, but within each mix, which species look to be performing the best, which of those plant species in attracting the highest diversity, the highest abundance, and how they perform throughout the season. And from that, we can create what we can call sort of a best mix. And this is the sort of mix that now is being used by, if you go to the Xerces webpage, you'll find this mix with a couple of modifications, etc. And so, like I say, we work closely with those groups because they're very good at outreach and delivery to a different set of audience than we might be targeting depending on the situation. But you'll see here, there's a mixture of perennials and annuals. And in blue, you'll see the general bloom period, so we're covering the whole season there. And scaling up then, right? So we do the original test were these small 45 feet long plots, but that's not big egg. So now we're scaling up the plots that are large. And so this is the context where you see a strip is about 600 to 800 meters long, about 20 or so feet wide, and it runs along one side of watermelon. The overhead irrigation going on one side, and that photograph is a field about to be seeded in watermelon for the season. A big field, about 40 acres. Okay, so coming down to the final result with functioning is, do those plantings make any sort of difference in terms of the delivery of pollination service on the crop nearby? Clearly, they enhance the pollinators compared to the lack of the strip. But what about pollination? So the idea is, in the context again where we have a field with a control margin that is kind of weedy or bare often in California, compared to one with wildflower mixes, do we get this delivery of service that leads to an increase in yield? And so we've worked with 6 farms in a paired design with an enhanced and unenhanced margin, looking at 9 different wildflower species and comparing the different, looking at pollination visitation on the crop adjacent to the control versus the enhanced flower strip. And here's what we find. And you can look at that and see, okay, so it's control in gray, so then unenhanced and enhanced in yellow. And so this is looking at the resulting fruit density and fruit mass coming at different distances, 1, 10, 20, 40, and 80 meters in from a control versus an enhanced border. And it looks pretty good, except it's probably not significant as a scientist. And that's, we have low replication, and it's a modest increase, really. I mean, this slide is sort of almost a, it's not a fallacy, but it's a trend in the right direction, and that's it at this point. So it's really important to recognize that. So we see some benefit, but we don't. I'm unfortunately disappointed if we try not to have an agenda when we go into science. We found a non-significant effect at this point. These are strips that are put in for 1 year, however, and then they're taken out. They're meant to be ephemeral. We would like that not to be the case, but you can talk about crop rotation and you want the strip in there when they're growing wheat and all sorts of crazy stuff. And so I want to show some other data from my collaborator Rufus Isaacs at Michigan State, who's doing the same thing with blueberries. Blueberries is a perennial crop. The bushes are in the ground for a long time. The strips are allowed to stay in the ground for multiple years. And so what Rufus finds, so in our plots, the data were from sort of the equivalent of his first year, which is, in his case, 2009. And so what he found, this is looking at, again, control fields in black and enhanced fields in yellow, with the dashed line being the interior and the straight line being the edge. And what you basically can take from this slide, this is visitation rate. In year one, there's no difference. It doesn't matter whether you're on a control or an enhanced field. It's nice that the enhancement is there, but it's not really delivering an increased number of bees visiting. But you get that increase over time. Okay? And so as the strip's there a longer time, it probably is a population effect. It's building up the populations of wild pollinators locally, and now they're spilling over or delivering that service to the crop. And why we see a modest effect could be because our wildflower strips are really attractive, as some raised over here, and so that they're visiting our strips and not the crop, real issue. Or it could be because we haven't left them in the ground long enough, and so we don't see that effect. And so that is really what we're doing now, is targeting growers who will let us have those strips in the ground for a longer period of time, and also working with possible management scenarios, like saying, what if we mow that strip with a high mow at the time of bloom? So the flower numbers really dramatically decrease for those 3 weeks that watermelons in bloom, and then they'll flush back. It turns out they'll come back and provide support later. In California, as an agricultural industry, to go a certain way. And so the more I think we can encourage people to pull back and think about a diversified landscape where we can try and integrate different types of crops and do that, against the need for economies. I'm hopeful that we can do that. And I know that's stuff that Gordon is working on, and other people at Berkeley, Claire Kremen's group at Berkeley, and many other people as well. So the idea of diverse, robust populations of managed and wild bees. Okay, thanks.